Ladies and gentlemen, if you will join me in welcoming the Honorable President Jimmy Carter.
Thank you. Well, it's always a pleasure to be introduced by a real president, and I'm very thankful to you for that. It's also a great pleasure for me and Rosen to come back to Georgia Southwestern University. We both went here as students. All three of our sons came here as students, and it's been one of the most gratifying experiences of my life to see this institution grow into a very wonderful center for education for Southwest Georgia. I have a very pleasant duty today as a loyal Democrat, and it is to introduce you to a candidate whom I really admire, who is also a fellow Georgian. No response. As a matter of fact, John Edwards went to school in Thompson, Georgia. He finished his 6th grade of grammar school in Thompson, Georgia, before he moved on to other lesser states. It's wonderful to have a Southerner who comes here to join with us today and look into the future of this great nation. I don't think any of us in this audience would disagree with the fact that Southerners have a unique perspective about what this country ought to be, dedicated to peace, but courage when our country is endangered, with great attention paid to people who are less fortunate than some of us, and who want to see the finest ideals of integrity and truthfulness, as well as dedication in our government at all levels. John Edwards was born in South Carolina. That's where my grandmother came from. As a matter of fact, he was born in Seneca, South Carolina, where Rosen's father's brother lived, and then later he moved to North Carolina, where my ancestors came from. And of course, then he went on, as you know, to serve in the U.S. Senate, where he was a key player in 2 or 3 things. One is to emphasize the plight of the need for further attention from those who are working families in America. He also served in that crucial period on the Intelligence Committee. So he's an expert, having long years of experience in analyzing the threat of terrorism and others to our nation's integrity. I've observed with some attention what has been done already with the very, very early debates and campaign techniques of the different candidates. And I can say without equivocation that no one who's running for president has presented anywhere near as comprehensive and accurate a prediction of what our country ought to do in the field of environmental quality, in the field of health care for those who are not presently insured, for those who suffer from poverty, and with a special attention to a subject he knows quite well, and that is the rural areas of America. It's not my role to make a speech this morning, but I would just like to close my introduction by saying that he has a very good chance to do well. As a matter of fact, I saw yesterday, if you take USA Today, you probably saw the same article. The headline was, Edwards ahead of all Republican candidates. And compared to Rudy Giuliani, who's by far in front in the Republican field, it's Edwards 49, Giuliani 41. And compared to Fred Thompson, whom Rosen and I used to admire on Law and Order, we don't admire him anymore, but who is one of the leading in the Republican packs because he hasn't been campaigning yet and nobody knows him. It's Edwards 14 points ahead of Fred Thompson, who's now in the 2nd place. So I want to introduce to you a man who has an excellent chance to become the next president of the United States, my friend, John Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. President, very much. I have to say, I'm looking at the audience, and you're all clapping, and the first one to sit down was my wife, Elizabeth. I guess she's heard me speak enough that she feels like she's entitled to that. She's doing very well, though, if I can say on her behalf. She's doing great. I want to say a thank you to Dr. Blanchard and this great university for having me here. President Carter and I spoke weeks ago, and he issued this invitation for me to come and be with him and be able to be here. And it was a great honor for me to be able to come and be with all of you. I'm so proud of what President Carter has done his entire life, and the extraordinary strength and courage and compassion. He's become a model for what a public servant's supposed to be, not only in the United States of America, but in the world. He's been an extraordinary ambassador for America in all parts of the world, and we're very, very proud of you, President Carter. I want you to know that. And Mrs. Carter and Elizabeth were speaking this morning about what it's like to campaign on the campaign trail. And the President and Mrs. Carter were saying they went different ways on the campaign when he was running for president the first time. And Elizabeth and I have been through that sort of similar experience. And I know what the value is of having a strong, smart, good woman out there campaigning for you. So I know what an incredible asset you've been to the President and to the country, Mrs. Carter. Thank you. I came today to focus on several issues, most of which have to do with the struggles that a lot of Americans are faced with health care, with poverty, and what I think is a crisis in America, which is our environment and the issue of global warming. But before I get to that, I wanted to say a word about something that appeared in the news today. It appears that, or at least there are reports in the media, that President Bush intends to ask for an additional, on top of what he's already asked for, an additional $50 billion to help fund the surge in Iraq. I just want to say, at least on my behalf as a candidate for the Democratic nomination for President of the United States, the Congress will be coming back next week, and I think the American people have had enough excuses. They don't want excuses anymore. They want to see this war come to an end. They want to see it brought to an end. And what the Congress should do when they come back next week is make it absolutely clear. No timetable, no funding. And there should be no further excuses. The Congress needs to stand their ground. They had a mandate from the American people in the election of November in 2006, and they need to meet that mandate. Today's also the 2-year anniversary of the hurricane hitting the Gulf Coast. And what's happened in all the Gulf Coast, but particularly in New Orleans, where I've spent a huge amount of time, is heartbreaking. And it's really a national embarrassment. It is. It says so much about the quality of the American people, the way the American people responded to this horrible situation in New Orleans, as opposed to the ineptitude of the government. And I've been to New Orleans many times. In fact, I went to New Orleans, not New Orleans, but to Baton Rouge, right after the storm hit. And I'll never forget this as long as I live. I'm walking through the evacuation center, the place where people were being housed who'd come out of New Orleans. And I was shaking hands, saying hello to people. And I came on this fellow. He was sort of in his 40s, I'd say, short, stocky, strong looking. And I asked him how he was doing, and he said, well, he was doing okay. He said, but he lived in the 9th Ward of New Orleans, and when the storm came, he lost his house. And the place he worked for 20-some-odd years was underwater. And so as a result, he had also lost his job. And he said he was sleeping on a sleeping bag on the concrete floor just a few feet from where we were standing. And he said, but you know, when I got here, they told me that if you go outside in the morning at 5 o'clock, sometimes people will come by in pickup trucks and pick you up and put you to work. And he said, I've been here about a week and a half, and I've been out there every morning at 5 o'clock. And he said, they hadn't picked me up yet, but they will. That man is what America is supposed to be about. Somebody like that who works hard, takes responsibility, wants to do everything they can. And if this country, if our country, this country that we all love so much, if we can't be there for a man like that, what good are we? What good is the government if it can't be there for people who are absolute innocent victims? And that's what we've seen in New Orleans. You know, my own view is we don't need a surge in Baghdad, we need a surge in New Orleans. We need to get help to the people who've been hurt. And I think we have enormous work to do in New Orleans, enormous work to do. I can tell you, having been there many times, and I suspect many of you have been there also, that what you see is you see no change. You know, many, many billions of dollars have been appropriated by the federal government, over $90 billion for the Gulf Coast recovery. And I have no idea where that money is, because it is not getting to the ground. It is not helping the people whose homes have been destroyed. I mean, if you walk through the Ninth Ward of New Orleans today, it looks almost exactly like it did a month or 2 months after the hurricane hit. And the only changes you see are the result of good people, faith-based groups, charitable groups, volunteers who've gone to New Orleans to work, to help. You don't see the government. In fact, you don't see any sign of the government. And the people who've actually been able to rebuild their homes, for the most part, did it on their own. And this is not the way it should be. I have to tell you, I had a personal experience. I want to say this since I know we have a lot of young people in this audience. A year or so ago, I took 700 college kids who gave up their spring break to go to New Orleans to work to rehab houses. In other words, instead of going to the beach and having fun with their friends and partying with their friends, they went with me to work in these hot, dirty, nasty conditions. I know, I was there doing it. I'm 54 now. I had trouble keeping up with them. But it was amazing and inspirational for me to see what these young people did. I mean, giving up part of their lives to go down and help their fellow Americans. Don't tell me that young people don't care about their country. Don't tell me that they're apathetic and cynical. We could have taken 3,000 or 4,000. We just had nowhere to put them. They were absolutely volunteering, wanting to go help. I mean, to me, it says something about not only the character of America, it actually says something about the character of our young people, that they were willing to do that. And I think there are several things, let me just mention them, and then I want to get on to a couple of other issues. There are several things we need to be doing in New Orleans. First of all, we got to make New Orleans safe again. It's not secure. The crime rate's up. There are about 500 police officers short. The federal government should actually help fund 500 more police officers for New Orleans. The levees need to be rebuilt in a way that keeps the people of New Orleans safe and secure. And people can't come back if they don't have something to do. They need a job. And instead of giving these jobs to big multinational corporations who are shipping people in to do the work, my view is we ought to have 50,000 what I would describe as stepping stone jobs so that the people of New Orleans can actually rebuild their own city, that they can earn a prevailing wage, they can get good benefits, prevailing benefits, and so that they have something to do to support themselves, to be able to support their families. We also have to rebuild the infrastructure of New Orleans. Hospitals, schools, huge problems with schools being reopened, hospitals being reopened. I mean, people can't come home if their kids don't have a place to go to school, and they can't come home if something happens to somebody in their family if there's no hospital to go to get the health care that they need. So all these things need to be done in combination to rebuild the city of New Orleans. And what I would intend to do, assuming it's not done, and I'm worried that it won't be done by January of 2009, I will have a high-level person in the White House who reports to me every day on what they did in New Orleans yesterday. You know, plans are fine. I want to know what they did yesterday. And one other idea, something that I call Brownie's Law, and it's a very simple concept. The concept is if you're going to be in charge of a major agency of the United States government, you actually have to be competent and capable of doing the job, and you have to have some experience in what you're doing. I want to talk about three major issues, and then I'm going to spend time taking your questions. President Carter will also take your questions. About 40 years ago, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King gave a very important speech in Riverside Church in Harlem, in New York City. And in that speech, he spoke out really for the first time in a major way against the war in Vietnam, against the continuation of the war in Vietnam. And at that moment, he said that there comes a time in all of our lives, not just his or mine, in all of our lives, when being silent is a betrayal. Where being silent is a betrayal to yourself, a betrayal to your community, and a betrayal to your country. And in that case, he had determined that remaining silent on the war in Vietnam, even though he was concerned about a lot of the social problems that existed in America, issues of civil rights, issues of poverty, issues of health care, that he thought he could no longer stand quiet and watch the war in Vietnam continue. Well, the truth is that call to action applies today. Because silence is a betrayal. It's a betrayal for all of us. It's a betrayal when we stand silently and watch 47 million Americans who have no health care coverage. We find out from the reports that have come out in the last 24 hours that an additional 2.2 million Americans are without health care coverage just over the course of the last year or so. So the number's going up. It's not going down. And the stories that Elizabeth and I could tell you that we hear every day about health care would absolutely break your heart. They really would. I did a few weeks ago, I did a poverty tour that began in the Ninth Ward of New Orleans, went up through the Mississippi Delta, ended up in the Appalachian Mountains. But the last day of the poverty tour, I'm sitting at a picnic table with 6 or 8 people. And this guy was sitting about two people down from me. He was 51 years old. I'm 54, 3 years younger than me. And he told me that he had been born with a severe cleft palate. And as a result of that cleft palate, he couldn't speak. It was completely fixable, But he didn't have health care coverage, and he couldn't pay to have it fixed. And finally, somebody had volunteered to fix it, and he was so grateful because he could speak, that somebody had done it for him, taken care of him, and he was very noble and grateful about it. Here was the problem. They fixed it when he was 50 years old. This man had lived in the his name is James Lowe. James had lived in the United States of America for 50 years, not able to speak because he didn't have the health care that he needed. How can we stand quietly by and watch this continue? This is not okay. And it is not okay for us to allow this to continue to happen. Now, I have a very strong opinion about why we don't have universal health care. I think we don't have it. I'm speaking only for me, for no one else on the stage. Let me be clear. I believe we don't have universal health care because of drug companies, insurance companies, and their lobbyists. I think they stand between America and the health care that we need. And we desperately need a president who's actually willing to stand up to these people. Because without it, we will never have universal health care, period. It will never happen. Many of you know about some of the struggles that Elizabeth and I have had with Elizabeth's health and in our own family, but we're no different than millions of Americans. People are all very nice about it and very supportive, and we are extremely appreciative of that support. It means a great deal to our family. But I have to tell you, the challenges we face are just like the challenges most families face. I mean, if you were to ask people in any crowd, you or someone in your family been affected by cancer, almost every hand in the room goes up. Everybody's been affected by it. But the question is, are the people who have cancer, women who are diagnosed with breast cancer like Elizabeth, are they going to actually get the health care that they need? Will it be detected as early as possible because they have health care coverage? And will they get state-of-the-art health care? It's that simple. Now, here's what I believe. I believe if you are shopping for a presidential candidate, and I'm borrowing this from my wife Elizabeth, who said it many times, if you're shopping for a presidential candidate and they come before you and they tell you they have a health care plan, and you find out that that health care plan is not universal, then you should make them explain to you what man and what woman and what child in America is not worthy of health care. What man, what woman is not of equal value, who is not entitled to health care. Now, I'd go one step further. If you're looking at a presidential candidate who doesn't have a truly universal health care plan, you ought to be looking for another candidate. Because we need universal health care in this country. Here's what I won't spend a lot of time on my proposal. I'll let you ask me about it if you want. But my basic proposal is that we mandate coverage for every man and woman in the country, that we fill in the gaps in our health care system, which means we ban pre-existing conditions, no such thing as a matter of law, that we treat mental health exactly the same as physical health, mental health parity, preventive care, chronic care, long-term care are all covered. You can take your health care with you wherever you go. We've set up savings by a whole variety of techniques, using technology, electronic record keeping, taking on drug companies and insurance companies that'll save about $120 billion system-wide. So we deal with the problems that exist in today's healthcare system. Now, I don't believe you can have universal health care for free. There are some candidates who I think will make that argument. I just think people have been misled about this too long. There's cost associated with having everybody covered and bringing down health care costs for everybody. My plan costs $90 to $120 billion a year. I'll tell you that up front. And I pay for it by getting rid of George Bush's tax cuts for people who make over $200,000 a year. But beyond health care, we have 37 million people who wake up every single day in the United States of America literally worried about survival, worried about feeding and clothing their children. And you want to talk about something that says something about the character of America, what we're willing to do about it. Those pictures that came out of the Ninth Ward of New Orleans, we're not the only ones who saw those pictures. I saw this headline overseas shortly after the hurricane hit. Pictures of victims in the lower Ninth Ward, big headline, the shaming of America. The whole world is watching. They want to know whether the richest, most powerful nation on the planet actually thinks it's okay that millions of our people are living in poverty every single day. It's not okay. We, all of us, we have a responsibility to do something about it. And we can do something about it. And it's so misleading to hear these statistics coming out of Washington, D.C. You listen, if you're most of America, this is not just for the poor. This is also true for the middle class. People read their newspaper and they read these stats. All the politicians are crowing in Washington. Oh, look at the economic growth we had last year. Look at the economic growth we had the year before. They need to get out here in the real world and find out what's really going on, because what's really going on is all that growth is for the very wealthiest Americans. In fact, President Carter showed me an article this morning from the New York Times, and I don't have my glasses, but I think I can read it. It says, overall, the new data, this is the census data that just came out, the new data on incomes and poverty mesh consistently with the pattern of the last 5 years, in which the spoils of the nation's economic growth have flowed almost exclusively to the wealthy and extremely wealthy, leaving little for everybody else. That is exactly what's happened in America. Has there been economic growth? Yes, there has. And that economic growth has been limited almost entirely to the richest Americans and big multinational corporations. It does not flow to the vast majority of Americans. So, what you hear is, we fought a war. I've heard all these arguments because I've been out there preaching the gospel of doing something about poverty for a while now. And I hear every argument. I hear them all. We fought a war on poverty. It didn't work. LBJ led America in a war on poverty. It didn't work. Well, first of all, we need to be honest about what the war on poverty did. It wasn't perfect. There were some mistakes made. In some cases, we created dependence instead of independence. In some cases, we fed the cycle of poverty. There's no doubt about that. Whenever the country does something big and important, you can't be perfect the first time. But we also did a lot of good. It's because of the war on poverty that we had Head Start, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, Medicaid, Medicare, a whole series of laws that literally transformed America. And millions of Americans have benefited. Cut the poverty rate almost in half in the course of about a decade. Here's what I think we can do about poverty in America. I think there are very concrete things we can do. First, one I've already mentioned, universal health care. Half the bankruptcies in America are the result of health care costs. That's what drives half the people who go to bankruptcy court into bankruptcy. On top of that, the Congress, after a full decade, finally raised the minimum wage. It's going to go to $7.25 an hour. That's great. It's not enough. The minimum wage ought to be at least $9.50 an hour. It ought to be indexed so that it goes up on its own, so we don't have to keep going back to the Congress to raise it. I don't want to be too wonky. I think we ought to expand the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is the refundable tax credit for low-income families, make it available to single workers, get rid of the marriage penalty. I also think we need to strengthen, people are always surprised to hear me say this in North Carolina and Georgia, but I say it everywhere I go. I think we need to strengthen the right of workers to organize unions in the workplace so that they can have a stronger voice, so that they can collectively bargain. We also have the worst savings rate in the industrialized world. And what that means in real people's lives is they get 2 days before payday, and they have to pay a bill, or their children have to eat. And so the result is they go to the payday lender, right? And they pay 300%, 400%, 500% interest. And people who want to know why anybody would pay 300% or 400% interest, it's because when your children have to eat, you'll do whatever you have to do, right? And that's exactly what happens. We need to help people save. We can teach financial literacy, set up accounts for low-income families, match what they're able to save so they can create some assets, and that has to be married to a strong national, not state, strong national predatory lending law that cracks down on these predators and payday lenders that are preying on our most vulnerable families. I mentioned the stepping stone jobs in New Orleans. We ought to have 1 million of these jobs nationwide so that we can get people to work who are otherwise having trouble finding employment, so that they develop a work ethic. These are particularly for young people and chronically unemployed. We need to get them to work. They can work in libraries, they can work in public parks, they can work in community action centers. There are lots of places that we can put these young people to work and make them productive and put their lives on a track to be productive. And then finally, young people need to be able to go to college who want to go to college. I mean, this is a great venue for talking about that. But what's happened is President Bush has taken billions of dollars out of the federal budget to pay for financial aid for kids to go to college. This is insanity. It is absolutely crucial for our young people, as many as want to and are engaged, to have the chance to go to college. So here's my idea. It's called College for Everyone. And we've actually done it in a small section of eastern North Carolina. This is the concept. We should do this everywhere in America. You say to every young person in America, if you graduate from high school and you're qualified to be in college, commit to work at least 10 hours a week the first year you're in school. We pay for your tuition and books. Very simple. You don't give it to them. They have to work for it. But the result is they don't graduate from college with all this crushing burden of debt. It knocks down the barriers that exist for so many young people to be able to go to college. And really, all these ideas are about the same thing. They're about creating hope and opportunity for everybody. They're about not living in a country where the only people who are benefiting from the economy are the people at the top. I actually believe that a rising tide lifts all boats. I think if the middle class is doing well, it creates the kind of foundation we need for long-term economic growth. If we're lifting people out of poverty instead of driving people into poverty, strengthening and growing the middle class, that's exactly the foundation that America needs for long-term economic growth for the entire country, not just the middle class, not just for low-income families. And then finally, I just want to say a word about what I think is a crisis and something that I know President Carter has spoken eloquently about, which is our responsibility to look after this earth that we've been given. And that includes addressing the issue of global warming, which I think is a crisis. I think it's a crisis by any possible measure. I'm sure most of you are aware of this already. We are the worst polluter on the planet. We're 4% of the world's population. We put out 25% of the world's greenhouse gases. 25%, 22 million barrels of oil a day. That's what America uses. This has to change. And here's my idea. I think we ought to cap carbon emissions in America. I think we ought to reduce our carbon emissions by at least 80% by the year 2050. And I think we ought to bring that cap down every single year. And we ought to make the polluters pay. The people who are putting out carbon dioxide ought to have to get a permit to do it, and they ought to have to pay in an auction in order to be able to get that permit. That money can be used to transform the way we do energy in America. Wind, solar, cellulose-based biofuels. We ought to put, I believe, we ought to put at least $1 billion into our car companies, making the most innovative, fuel-efficient vehicles on the planet. And I'll just say this because I have some difference with some of my colleagues on this. I'm not in favor of building more coal-fired power plants because we don't at this point have the capacity to capture the carbon. I'm not in favor of new carbon-based fuels like liquid coal. We don't need to take a bad situation and make it worse. But then finally, and this is the thing you don't usually hear from politicians or presidential candidates. Finally, it's time to have the President of the United States who actually calls on America to be patriotic about something other than war, who says to America, if we are going to be strong and independent, we're going to have to be willing to sacrifice. There's another word you don't hear. You're going to have to be willing to sacrifice for this country that you love so much. All of us, together. And that means you're going to have to conserve. Conserve in your homes, conserve in your workplaces, drive more fuel-efficient vehicles. You cannot spend and innovate your way out of this global warming crisis. You cannot get America toward energy independence just by spending money and being creative. Every one of us are going to have to sacrifice and take responsibility for this country that we love. Which brings me to the last thing I want to say, which is, you know, I wish I could tell you that vote for me for president, and when I go to Washington, I'm going to solve all your problems. How many times have we heard that, right? Never going to happen. Here's the truth. The great change in America starts with you. The President of the United States cannot do these things alone. Your country needs you, not just in the area of energy, but in all these things that I've talked about already. Your voice needs to be heard. You need to be involved. And you've heard a lot of talk about personal responsibility, taking responsibility for yourself and your family. I believe in personal responsibility. I do. But I also believe that we have to be responsible for the country that we love so much. All of us, together. I mean, Elizabeth and I have had this question raised in a dark hospital room just a few months ago. Something that's now become very public. We had to make the decision about what we wanted to spend our lives doing, and this is it. This is the cause of our lives. But all of us have to take responsibility for this country that we love so much. To paraphrase Gandhi, we have to be the change that we believe in. It's the only way. The great movements in American history, a lot of people in this room grew up with the civil rights movement. You know where the civil rights movement started. It didn't start in the Oval Office. It started in communities just like this, where people had courage, where they spoke up and they marched and they changed this country. The same thing happened to end the war in Vietnam. I actually feel the same thing happening right now on a subject President Carter's been so eloquent about, which is ending this war in Iraq. But your country needs you. We cannot build the kind of America that all of us will be proud of without you. You need to take responsibility. If you actually want to live in a moral and just country, which I do, and I bet you do too, and you want to see America once and again leading in a moral and just world, we're going to need to do this together, all of us. But together, all of us can do it. Thank you all very much, and now I'll be happy to take your questions.